This is Gamer Weekly, bringing you the latest of what the video game scene has to offer. On today's episode of Gamer Weekly, I have Richard Rouse of Paranoid Productions, and we're going to be talking about The Church in the Darkness. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Gamer Weekly. With me today is Richard Rouse of Paranoid Productions. Thank you so much for coming onto the show.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
So for those out there that don't know who Paranoid Productions is, where can we say that, where was a good start for you guys?
Well, Paranoid Productions actually has been around quite some time. When I first started making games professionally, I started Paranoid Productions then with my very first game, which was called Odyssey, and this came out in 1996, so a while back now. And that was a top-down RPG for the Macintosh, only came out for the Macintosh. Then later we moved on to a first-person shooter after that called Damage Incorporated, also released as Paranoid Productions. And after that, I went and worked at a bunch of bigger companies. So I went to AAA, and I worked at places like Surreal Software, and then Midway, and Ubisoft, and Microsoft, and worked on a lot of different things over that time. Probably most people remember me for working on the Suffering games when I was at Surreal Software, and that was, probably one of my games that I still get nice comments on to this day, which is always good to hear. And then recently I said I kind of wanted to go back to making something smaller, something a little more experimental and weird that maybe wouldn't warrant a $50 million budget. So I'm back making The Church in the Darkness as the first sort of Paranoid Productions game coming out in this decade.
Did The Suffering have a $50 million budget to it?
Not quite. No, but that was 10 years back, and budgets for everything was lower back then. So it had a sizable, I think it was like $7 or $10 million or something like that. So still a pretty hefty budget. That was normal for that PS2 era that it came out on. But yeah, even when you're dealing with that size budget, just people's tolerance for, really risky material or really, not going for some sure bets is lower. So when you're doing something on more of an indie scope, you're really able to do exactly what you want to do creatively, and that can be a great feeling.
So, because I played The Suffering when it came out, and I have to say, I'm going to give you more positive praise on the game. That game was probably one of the most terrifying games that I have ever played in my life. So kudos to you guys for making that game as terrifying as it was.
Yeah, thanks, man. I do say that I have encountered a lot of conservatism, from publishers and things from big publishers that I've worked with on other projects. But The Suffering, we were lucky. We were, working with Midway on that, and they were, the company that made Mortal Kombat. So they were all down with all the gore we wanted, all the M-rated language we wanted, etc. And they let us do a lot of stuff with that project that a lot of other companies would not have. So I think that helped it be unique and go to some dark places that not many other games have gone.
And speaking of dark places, the current game that you guys are working on is The Church in the Darkness. So is it similar, like horror-esque that we're walking into this? Like, what is The Church in the Darkness?
Yeah, a lot of people ask if it's a horror game too, since they remember me from the Suffering games, and I like to say that it has the same dark subject matter, but you wouldn't really call it a horror game. It's the Suffering was real world sort of disturbing situations, like the prison, like the haunted slave ship that you found, like the old asylum and things. These were all real world locations, but then with the supernatural added to it, right? So you had these reincarnated creatures that were crawling out of the woodwork and reincarnating themselves and doing all this horrible stuff. And this is sort of The Church in the Darkness is trying to take on some dark real world subject matter, that being, a religious cult in the 1970s, which is where the game is set, but not have those supernatural elements to it, not have the sort of science fiction or fantasy or whatever that's in so many games that gives them the opportunity to really, go to some crazy places in terms of abilities and so forth.
So for the dark subject matter, though, it's more of like you're not dealing with the horrors of exactly monsters, but it's more of the scary stuff that you see in actual everyday life.
Yeah, exactly. That I've found the world of cults fascinating for a while. Like a lot of people, I think I was interested in cults originally because of you hear about a tragedy with a cult, or they went and attacked someone, or they harmed themselves in some horrible way. So you hear about those stories. But then and that sort of attracted me originally. But then looking at cults, I found it fascinating that so often these groups think they're doing a really good thing, that they have the one true way. They're going to fix society. They're going to fix themselves, whatever it is. And some really strong people end up joining these groups because they really want to make a difference, really want to change the world. And then, sometimes those groups are fine. Sometimes they go and live in an alternative society and don't hurt anybody and don't hurt themselves and everything's good. And then we tend to hear about when they go badly. And I just found that fascinating and thought how interesting as something that could be explored in a game where, you can make choices and the story can sort of shift around you to just sort of look at all sides of the cult subject.
Because you're not the one that's controlling the cult, you're in the cult.
Not quite. Your nephew is in the cult,
okay.
And you're actually infiltrating this group to try to find out if he's okay. So the setup is it's the 1970s. There's a group called the Collective Justice Mission. They're based in California, and they're very left in their politics. So they're integrationist. Before many churches were like that. They're anti-Vietnam War. They're kind of socialist, and they feel persecuted in the U.S. because the U.S. was very hostile to left-wing groups in that period. So they decide to move down to South America and build sort of a compound, something they call Freedom Town. And everyone has moved down there. And as a result, some of the relatives who were left behind in the States are like, well, what's going on with this person? I don't hear from them much anymore. I'm kind of worried. This seems really weird. So you are you have this nephew who's in the group, and his mother has asked you to infiltrate, because you have a background in law enforcement and stuff, to go down there and try to sneak in and just try to find him and see if he's okay, see if he wants to leave or not.
So it's very much based on the I can't remember what exactly that cult, the biggest cult thing that happened in history, that happened in the 70s. I can't remember what it was called exactly.
No, you're probably talking about Jonestown.
That's exactly the one.
Jones and Jonestown.
So is it very heavily based pretty much on how that whole situation went down?
I mean, yeah, there are some obvious sort of inspirations there, but I actually researched a bunch of different groups, and it's not certainly not a documentary or anything. And there were a lot of other. The interesting thing about the 70s was there were a lot of different cult groups springing up at that time. Again, because you had in that period, you're coming out of the 60s, which was much more positive, and we're going to change the world, and we're going to change America and make it better in all these ways. And that sort of wasn't working out. At the same time, you had like the FBI cracking down on these sort of groups, and people were sort of disillusioned with how it was working, so they started going even more radical. And people, you have to remember in that time period in the 60s and 70s, everyone was afraid of nuclear annihilation at any point, right? Because the Cold War was ongoing and no one knew if they were going to live to see tomorrow. So why not go join a different group? Because what we're doing doesn't appear to be working. Why not move to South America? It's going to be safer than staying where we are, where we might be killed at any moment. So it was a really interesting time for a lot of different groups I found from that era of people really trying different things, and sort of young people joining those groups, and people from all walks of life just sort of being fed up with it and wanting to do something different. And like I said, we think about Jonestown because that was a horrible, one of the most horrible of the cult-related tragedies. But there are other groups like that form communes that moved up into the woods in California and have been there ever since, and are just these little groups that don't get the headlines because nobody's dying there, but they are essentially cult groups, and that they're living off by themselves. Sometimes there's a charismatic leader, but nothing bad is happening.
Who knew that on Gamer Weekly you would be getting a history lesson on cults?
Sorry.
No.
Too deep on that.
No. You're good. Absolutely. Like, honestly, I found the game on Steam, and I thought the idea of the game was extremely interesting, and the trailer for it was honestly really intense. So, how exactly does this game play out? So, is it more of like a stealth game, or how does it play exactly?
Yeah, I call it action infiltration, but there's definitely stealth elements to it if you want to go that way. It's a top-down perspective, so I sometimes compare it to old Metal Gear games, as people get that association. If you want to go back even farther, the game I was most inspired by was the original Castle Wolfenstein. Not a lot of people know, before Wolfenstein was the first-person shooter that we know and love now, it was a top-down sneak into a Nazi castle game where you could get disguises and you could, knock out guards, and you could, sort of play it however you wanted. And it was also a game that changed every time you played it as well. So that was a big inspiration to me, of just having, you're going into this compound, going into Freedom Town to try to find your nephew. And I'm always thinking, well, how would this really go, right? If you went into somewhere like that, would you just murder everyone you found until you found your nephew? Probably not, right? Because then you would be a mass murderer, right? And most people aren't like that. Instead, you would probably try to avoid detection. You would try to stay out of wherever the guards might be, and just try to find, where is he, try to find some documents that might help you find his location, or talk to people who seem like they'd be friendly to you and would help you in that situation. But you still have the option to play it violently if you want, because you can go sneak up on the guards, take them down, take their weapons, shoot people in some limited amount. It's definitely a game where if you get overwhelmed by too many guys, though, your best option is often to run or to find a good place to hide, because you're not going to be able to take on a whole group of guys. But if it's just you and one other person, sure, you can shoot it out with them, and that can be a viable path as well. So there's really, I guess what I'm saying is, there's a lot of different ways to play the game. But yeah, it's mostly an infiltrate, sort of try to avoid detection. And that actually, and how you play the game affects how the story comes out too, because the group will react to you differently based on how you're playing. And your nephew, once you find him, will react to you differently based on, what you've been doing in the camp. If you've been murdering a ton of people, he's going to be terrified of you, and he's not going to want to talk to you. And you're going to have to then decide what to do in that situation.
So there's multiple, I'm guessing then there's probably multiple endings for the game as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And the interesting thing, as I was talking about those cult groups, is that there's, so many different types of groups, and some are bad and some are more benign. And the nature of the cult changes every time you play too. So their dogma and sort of they hate America, that's always the same. And they're always militant. They're always armed, and they will shoot you if you're trespassing. However, sometimes they are, otherwise not going to hurt anybody. And if just left alone, they would just live happily in the South American jungle for decades. But in other ones, more nefarious things may be happening. And that's what you're trying to figure out while you're in there. And that changes every time you play as well. So the game has roguelike elements. So there's a little bit of permadeath, though we're a little more forgiving on that than some games. But it's designed to be replayed with this narrative where you don't know which version of the cult have I gotten this time.
So is it going to be kind of, I know this is a completely different tone kind of game, but is it going to be similar to like how like the Stanley Parable was, or something? I don't know if you played that game before, where it's like,
sure, yeah.
Okay, where it's like, there's so many different endings and you can have so many different ways of playing it, but the game is only like an hour long per like thing that you do.
Right. It's a bit longer than that, but I say, and we're still working on it, so we're not sure. And it is something that I've seen people, we have a demo we've been showing at a few places, like we showed it at PAX and at PAX West a few months back. And some people would come up and they get through the demo in like 5-10 minutes. Other people could play it for half an hour happily, and just exploring it slower and taking their time, being really carefully avoiding detection so they never set off the alarms, that sort of thing. So it really depends on the type of player you are, and we've also got multiple difficulty levels and all that, and it does have the permadeath too. So if you screw up, you're going to have to start again from the beginning of the game. But yeah, I mean, I think if you play the game well, I'm estimating 2 to 4 hours to play through one time. But again, you're only seeing one version of the cult then. So if you want to go back and see the other narrative stuff on some of the other permutations, you'll want to replay it after that. And yeah, there's going to be, because you have the combination of, you don't know what the cult's like, and there's several different flavors of that. And you also then have the choice to play lethally, play, non-lethally, but still aggressively, or completely avoid detection. And these things will have ramifications on what happens in the narrative as well. So yeah, you can get a lot of different endings out of it.
And because I also saw in the trailer too, that at one point there's a few people that gather around and there's a help us sign. Is that something like you can try and convince other cult members into working with you to try and get everybody out? Or is that something that happens like without your say in the game?
No, that's I don't want to give away too many spoilers on all the things you might find in there, but there are characters you meet and talk to in the game, other than your nephew, other than the cult leaders, who will if you do the right thing for them, might agree to help you in some way, right? So, and again, they may or may not want to help you depending on which version of the cult it is that time too. So you're sort of seeing different sides of how this version of the cult has affected these specific characters, and then that also then impacts gameplay and what they'll be willing to do for you.
Well, I am extremely excited to play the game. And is there a release date announced for the game yet?
We've said 2017, so sometime later this year, not this month, not next month, but somewhere farther in the future than that. But yeah, we're definitely shooting for this year.
If you guys want to add it to your wish list, you can just go on Steam and do that. And it's coming out for PC, PS4, and Xbox One.
That's right, and Macintosh is planned as well. So Steam users with Macintoshes, this is your game, possibly. And I was glad because I started back on the Macintosh a long time ago. My first games were Macintosh. I was just glad to be able to do a Mac version again.
And will it be out on Linux?
Well, that's to be decided. I've gotten a few number of requests of, hey, wouldn't it be cool to do a Linux version? And it's not something we've had time to look into too much yet because we're really focused on making the game, but we certainly haven't ruled it out.
Sorry, Linux users, it's going to be a little bit. Well, Richard, thank you so much for coming onto the show. And how can people find out more information about your game?
I like to encourage everyone to get on the mailing list. If you wish list it, we do have the Steam forums are up there, and I post things on there, and people ask questions on there sometimes. So there's always there. That's great. But there's also the mailing list, as I mentioned. If you go to the website, which is at paranoidproductions.com, and then if you go paranoidproductions.com/church, it'll take you right to the Church in the Darkness page, and there's a mailing list sign up on there, and you can see the trailers and some gameplay footage, screenshots, all that sort of stuff is up there. You can also find us on social media. If you search for the Church in the Darkness on Facebook, we'll come up, or we are at Church Darkness on Twitter.
All right, sounds good. So yeah, definitely check out the Church in the Darkness. I think it's going to be probably one of the most interesting games that you're going to be playing this year, hopefully this year. It's looking like this year. So
it's looking like this year. That's right.
So thank you so much for coming onto the show, and everybody out there listening to the show, thank you so much. You can also listen to the show on iTunes, SoundCloud, Google Play, and maybe even your mom's toaster. All right. Thank you so much for listening. Bye-bye.